So our elders always start the services on Sundays, and they will do it anywhere from 5 minutes early to right on time. But as soon as one of them walks toward the pulpit, just silence falls across the auditorium. And I laugh because I say, you guys are well trained. You know what to expect and you know what is coming. The Sermon on the Mount, a great study. It is, of course, as you probably already know, the longest public sermon of Jesus that is recorded. Now, there's a debate about the longest sermon because you get over to John and you get into chapters 14 and 15 and 16 and on, and you see a longer discussion from him, but that is amongst his disciples. That one's a little more isolated. This one is public, and of course, Matthew puts all of it here for us in one place, and I'm sure you've already talked about a lot of those things. But when we think about the Sermon on the Mount, I like to think of it this way. It is the heart of the gospel in one take. If you were to try to summarize everything about who we are supposed to be, as far as how we are to think and how that is to impact and influence our behavior, our actions, and our deeds, here it is in one take. In these 3 chapters, the heart of the gospel, the heart of Jesus' message to us in summary. Now, if you look at chapter 5, verses 17 through 20 here of Matthew, which you've already studied, I know. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For surely I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law, till all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so, shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. I would submit to you that to understand what we're going to be talking about tonight in chapter 5, beginning at verse 21, and I have a long one all the way down through verse 48 of the text. In order to understand what comes in this next section of 27 verses, you have to first grasp what he just said in verse 20. That your righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. You see, when Jesus comes preaching, He's preaching to a people whose religious leaders have misused and abused the law of Moses. They have taken a law that while it is, yes, concerned with the outward deeds, it does not ignore the heart, and they have ignored the heart. They have only concerned themselves with what one can see, concerning what one does with one's hands, and what one speaks with one's mouth. There's no regard for the heart. In fact, when you come to Matthew chapter 23 and you see Jesus over and over again, you hypocrites, you hypocrites, you hypocrites. Well, that reveals to us the very essence of the heart of the Pharisees and the Sadducees as well, and the scribes, men who were obsessed with the outer man, but had little regard for the inner man. But Jesus comes on the scene, and Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. Jesus is both the Son of Man and the Son of God. He is fully God and fully man. He knows the trials, He knows the temptations, He knows the difficulties of men. He faces the devil down eye to eye in Matthew 4, beginning at verse 1. And yet He is God from eternity, John 1, verses 1 through 3. And everything that exists because it has been made through Him. And so when He comes into this world, He knows who we are because He was one of the Godhead fashioning us. God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit, as we know them on this side of Jesus' appearance. And so when He comes as one who is sinless into a world of sin and lives sinlessly. Think about Romans 8 verses 3 and 4. For what the law could not do in that it was weak through the flesh, God did by sending His own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh on account of sin. He condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. What the law could not do, there's not a man, there wasn't a woman, who lived perfectly under the law of Moses. There are those who were blameless, yes, but not perfect. Not keeping every jot, every tittle, every little letter of the law in its fullness. That is why Paul can say in Romans 3:23, we have all sinned and come short of the glory of God. He condemns both Jew and Gentile in Romans 3 as sinners, and rightfully so, because he demonstrates throughout chapter 1 at verse 18 through chapter 2 that both the Jew and the Gentile had ignored the law of God. But Jesus, coming into the world, God in the flesh, condemned sin in the flesh. He said, here is how you live. Here is how you think. Here is what you do. And that stands in stark contrast to the religious leaders who were only concerned with the outer man, who never really addressed the inner man. And so when we see Jesus coming and saying, you have heard, but I say, he's quoting the law of Moses. But he's not quoting the law of Moses in order to say to those people, Moses had it wrong, let me tell you what is right. He's quoting it in the context of those who have abused it and misapplied it. And in fact, in several of these instances, he will reference ways in which it has been abused, in which it has been misused, and say, this is what God actually has in mind because I am speaking it to you. So in that, he expresses his authority. He expresses his righteousness. And so tonight I've titled our lesson, You Have Heard. And he focuses on 6 areas, but I'm going to summarize them in 5 because one is kind of a twofer. He talks about adultery and then he talks about divorce within just back to back within about the same breath. And so we're going to combine those down into one for the sake of our study this evening. But what I hope you can see by the time we're done is that Jesus is not only concerned with the outward man. He's not just concerned with outward faithfulness, but he's concerned with inward faithfulness that leads always to outward faithfulness. If the heart is right, everything in the life will flow forth rightly from it. Proverbs 4:23 teaches us that, doesn't it? Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it flow the issues of life. Jesus referenced that himself when he says, they draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they would worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of man. When he called the multitude to himself, he said to them, hear and understand, not what goes into the mouth defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles a man. Matthew 15, verses 8 through 11, which partially is a quotation from Isaiah 29 at verse 13. And if you want to see a tremendous text that draws the distinction between outward obedience and inward obedience, and how God is not going to receive outward obedience as though it is sufficient, just turn back to the very first chapter of Isaiah. Because God chastises Israel for, yes, coming into the courts, yes, bringing sacrifices, but doing it with hearts that are not turned toward Him. On one hand, they're out here with the idols, and then the next day they're in the temple. That's not going to be acceptable before a righteous God who demands our all. You have heard. Let's begin at verses 21 through 26. You shall not murder. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder. And whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the judgment. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Agree with your adversary quickly while you're on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge hand you over to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Assuredly, I say to you, you'll by no means get out of there till you have paid the last penny. You shall not murder. Whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. The first part of the quotation here, of course, is one of the 10 commandments, right? You can take that back to Exodus 20 at verse 13, you shall not murder. And we understand explicitly in Numbers 35 that God draws a distinction between that which is premeditated murder and that which is what we would generally refer to as being manslaughter. There were cities of refuge for the one who killed someone unintentionally to flee, but for the one who had committed that murder in a premeditated fashion, who had, as the text would indicate, who would lie in wait to so commit the crime, that one was to be put to death. And so when Jesus says to them, you have heard it said to those of old, you shall not murder, whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment, he's speaking something that they know well, and that they would be judged. Here the judgment isn't looking at the final judgment. Here the judgment seems to be in context of what he's talking about, the idea of the council. Would stand before a judge and, as we would say, a jury, and you would face conviction for that. That's the heart of what he's talking about. And of course, when we look at the references to the Old Testament and the meaning of what he is getting at here, the second part of the statement seems to allude to an interpretation on the part of the teachers with regards to standing judgment before the Sanhedrin. I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. Whoever says to his brother, Raca, or you fool, in danger of the council, or in danger of there, he says, hellfire, Gehenna, of course referencing the valley of Hinnom outside of Jerusalem, where it is said that there was a fire that burned and burned and burned due to the refuse and the trash that was cast there. But when we look at this idea, Raca is an Aramaic expression. It is in some commentators' minds referenced as a mild curse word, a mild bit of profanity that would be spoken against another. And it basically meant one who was empty-headed. You have no sense about yourself. We might more liken it to something like saying to someone today, for all intents and purposes, you are just stupid. You're an idiot. You have no sense whatsoever. But then the second term here, fool, is actually the Greek term from which our English word moron comes from, believe it or not. And it takes on a moral connotation, whereas Raca really kind of just says, you're an idiot, you're stupid. The second one here says, not only are you stupid, but you are morally bankrupt. There is nothing good about you whatsoever. Now you can imagine that when we talk about our attitude toward one another, when I look at you and I say, there is nothing redeeming about you. When I look at you and I say, I can't see what anyone, you are just, what have I already done with that person in my heart? What have I already done with someone like that? When the only thing I think of is, man, that guy's such an idiot. Don't tell me you haven't ever thought that way about someone. Because I imagine we have all found ourselves at some point in time with someone getting underneath our skin, frustrating us, maybe an employee that was underneath us, and it seemed like they could just never get it right. Maybe a brother or sister in Christ. Just always seem to push the wrong buttons. What have we done to them in our heart already? They are no longer, through our eyes, being seen as uniquely created in the image of God and a bearer of Him as an eternal soul. We don't see them that way anymore. What we see when we look at that person, what we see when we hear their name, is how we have labeled them. How we have so ordained them. And so Jesus here is getting to the heart of it. I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. It is more than just a matter of murder. The heart of the issue is anger. The heart of the issue is disdain. And that is what comes out in Raca. That is what comes out in full. Think about Ephesians 4:26 and 27. It says, let each of you speak truth with your neighbor, beginning at verse 25, for we're members of one another. Be angry and do not sin, and do not let the sun go down on your wrath, nor give place to the devil. Be ye angry and sin not. Jesus talks about anger here without cause. There may very well be a time for anger with cause. But Paul says explicitly, let not the sun go down on your wrath. He says, be angry and sin not. Now, how can we take that and we can apply that? Well, Jesus goes on here to talk about reconciliation, doesn't he? That's the application of the heart of it. Don't be angry with your brother, but rather be reconciled. He says, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar. And go and be reconciled. Well, hold on, wait. Where's Jesus when he's preaching the Sermon on the Mount? He's in Galilee. By the way, that's a multi-day journey from Jerusalem. If you are at the altar leaving your gift, you're in Jerusalem. He's preaching to a crowd that is in Galilee, some of whom, yes, have come from Judea and Jerusalem and roundabout areas, but some of them who are homed there. And so all of these people from a variety of places, he says, wherever it is, you're at the altar, you go back and you take care of that. That might be quite a sacrifice. If you're up there near Nazareth and some of the areas where Jesus was raised and where he did some of his initial preaching and his work, that is quite a journey back. Say, leave your gift and go a 3-day journey back home to take care of the issue? That almost seems nonsensical, doesn't it? I mean, I'm already here. It's 3 days back, and then I'll have to take care of that, then 3 days back to Jerusalem, and I've got to travel 3 days. Man, you're talking about taking over a week of my time to deal with it. Jesus says it's that significant. He says you deal with the reconciliation that is needed. And he illustrates that with the idea of one who has a judgment against you. And you think about Proverbs 25:8, do not go hastily to court, for what will you do in the end when your neighbor has put you to shame? Maybe pride keeps you from being reconciled. Here in this instance, some issue between the two of you, and now it's going to be brought before a magistrate in relationship to the Jews, before probably the Sanhedrin or some lower court of it. And guess what happens? You're found guilty. You're cast in. And now you will remain until you pay the last penny. Why? Because you wouldn't be reconciled to your brother. Now that has spiritual implications when you turn to Matthew chapter 18, doesn't it? That if there's a fault with your brother, you go to him. You go to her and you tell it to them personally, Jesus says. Of course, if they won't hear you, they bring some witnesses. They won't hear, tell it to the whole church. They won't hear the church. Well, there's a process. But the reconciliation begins with me seeking to be reconciled to my brother. You have heard it said to those of old, you shall not murder. Whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you, whoever is angry. You see, don't allow anger to rule your behavior. Rather seek reconciliation. We think about the Sermon on the Mount and inward faithfulness. Not anger, but a desire for reconciliation. Those are two very different ways of looking at our relationships with each other. If I go into my relationships with my brethren every single time saying that whatever comes, we're brethren. We're going to work this out. We're going to make sure we don't leave divided. That makes a difference. If I am committed to not having anger or hatred toward my brother or sister Christ, no matter what comes, that makes a difference. I'll tell you a story. There was something that happened to me about a decade or so ago where a letter was sent to the entire congregation by a brother who wasn't happy with me. And he and I had been having conversations over the course of multiple months about some of the things that he wasn't happy about. And I had no idea this letter was sent because I wasn't included on the list of email addresses that received it. But I very quickly heard about it. I have never been more hurt or angry with another brother or sister in Christ in all the years that I have worked with the congregation there, 17 now, as of the 27th of this month. The years of being a Christian, which predates that by a few years. Never had anything quite like that. I almost quit preaching. I would have never given that lesson at PTP. Wouldn't still be at Peninsula to have seen us through some floods, and thankfully, Lord willing, giving us an eldership and watching those men be installed and being a part of that and getting to step back and let them lead as they ought to lead. What a blessing that has been for me. If I'd quit, if I'd given up on that. But I realized in the middle of that process, all that hurt and that pain, that anger was doing me no good. In fact, it was making my wife miserable. It's making me miserable. It wasn't helping the congregation get through it. Certainly wasn't going to reconcile me to that brother. I had to decide that reconciliation if possible, was more important than anything else. Now, I'll tell you, in the end, there was no reconciliation. But I tell you, I did my best. The congregation did its best. They met with the brother. They tried to resolve it, but it never was able to be resolved with him. And that's a scar that I carry to this day. It's painful to think about. It's painful to talk about. I don't talk about it often. But this text brings it to mind. And I wonder if maybe there had been a different outcome had I had a different attitude in the beginning, when the letter first went out. Because I went from trying to make the situation right and talking with him and doing such things to being on the defensive and trying to prove myself right, which will come up a little later in our study. Don't murder, yes, but don't allow anger to rule you. Let's move to our next topic here. You shall not commit adultery. Again, you have heard it said, he says, to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman of lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Here the quotation comes, of course, from, again, the Ten Commandments. Again, we're right there at Exodus 20. Again, we're right there in Deuteronomy. We're right there reading what has been said from the beginning. And Jesus really helps us to understand what God always intended when he says, but I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart, which is where the 10th commandment comes in. You shall not covet. And amongst those things that you shall not covet is what? Your neighbor's wife. You shouldn't be looking over at her and thinking, I want her. Well, covetousness, that desire of the heart, it goes by another name. In many ways, that is lust. And so Jesus looks at this and he says, yes, you shall not commit adultery, but God wanted you to not even be lusting with your heart. He wanted you to stop it before it ever got there. And if there's ever an example of the damage of that done, you know what it is. It's David and Bathsheba. Biblically recorded, all of the wounds, all of the scars, all of the ugliness of it, right there on display for all of us to see. One who was once deemed a man after God's own heart, having a man murdered after having slept with his wife and getting him drunk trying to cover it up. That was a bad look for David. It was sinful, it was wrong, it was arrogant. It was wicked. But it all began when he was on his roof and looked and saw her. It began with lust. And so Jesus says, in relationship to that lust, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And so he takes this saying, you shall not commit adultery. He gets to the heart of what God intended. You have a wife. You need to rejoice in her, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. And he says, so if you have a temptation, he says, if it is your eye, if it is your hand, he says, cut it off. How about we put it another way as Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians 6 verse 18. Flee fornication. Run from it. You know, the young man who did the devotional, the intern, I don't remember his name now, sorry. Brother, I know you called me, I'm terrible with names. He mentioned Joseph and he mentioned Potiphar's house. And we know how that story goes, don't we? But I always love how Joseph responds. I cannot do this wickedness against my master, nor can I do it against God. I will not offend the man who trusts me by looking upon his wife. She is his wife. And I will not cause offense against my God who has preserved me. I won't sin in this matter. Flee fornication. Sexual immorality, as some translations read throughout the New Testament now. Fornication, both terms that maybe in the more broad vernacular, we don't often get down to the meaning of the word. You ask a lot of folks who didn't grow up around the KJV today what fornication means, and they have no idea. You ask folks who grew up around the KJV what fornication means, they don't necessarily know. Sexual immorality, that sounds good for our modern age, but it's kind of broad sounding at the same time, isn't it? In a society that's so afflicted with pornography and all kinds of, for lack of a better term, soft porn that is contained within daily television, as you've got half-naked folks running around and jokes being made about the shirts off in the movie theater. You know, I remember a movie a while back, one of the Marvel movies, when Thor takes his shirt off, and I was in the theater and I heard several women, ooh. Heard the same thing with men in movie theaters. When a character, an actress, is dressing down. Jesus says, flee fornication. Sexual immorality would many people say, well, that's sexually immoral. Well, it is, but it's not the term fornication, not the term that's used here. That is porneia. And for your understanding, as you look more broadly at it, as we come down into verses 31 through 32, and as you look throughout the pages of the New Testament, you've got to understand that this word explicitly relates to illicit sexual intercourse. It's not just thinking about it, it is doing it. It's not just imagining it, it is being fully engaged in it. And so when Jesus goes on here to say, furthermore, it's been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason, except sexual immorality, fornication, porneia, illicit sexual intercourse, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. Think about it in the context of what he has been talking about here. That we need to flee fornication. Furthermore, it's been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. It says, you cause her to commit adultery, except, he says, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality. I want you to think about what he's getting at. One right after the other. We know Matthew 19. We know that the Pharisees come questioning him. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? We understand historically there was a whole school of thought amongst the Jewish rabbis that said, basically, whatever the cause, if you are unhappy with her, a lot of times people say she burnt the toast. You can put her away. And it was about that loose. We shouldn't look at that and think, wow, how could they, when I see signs back home by the Walmart, no fault divorce, $199. $199. I'll draw up your divorce papers for you. That's what the lawyer's advertising. We're not any better as a society or as a culture. Now, the Jews should have known a whole lot better. They had the Pentateuch, didn't they? They had Genesis 2, didn't they? Where God himself brought Eve to Adam, and where we read Adam saying, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. We read, she shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. And where we read that the two of them are brought together and shall be one flesh. That a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. Where we read that they were both naked and were not ashamed. The beauty, the simplicity, the wonder of marriage. Of one man and one woman joined by God, quite literally with Adam and Eve. Intended to spend a lifetime devoted before God to one another. And yet, in the context of a discussion of lust, Jesus brings up the matter of the certificate of divorce. Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he's found some in uncleanness in her, is the way the New King James translates it. He writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. There's a lot of debate, even amongst my brethren, about what that uncleanness is. I think Jeremiah 3 is helpful in interpreting that, because God himself references a certificate of divorce that he has given to his own people. And he says, here's why I've done it. Jeremiah 3 verse 8, then I saw that for all the causes for which backsliding Israel had committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a certificate of divorce. When Jesus addresses in Matthew 19, he says, because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses permitted you. It wasn't commanded, it was permitted that you could give her a bill, a certificate of divorce. What is Jesus fundamentally getting at here? The heart of the law, that you shall not commit adultery, especially as it impacts the marital home. The heart of that is in lust. That's where it all begins. That is where it all starts. And if we refuse to lust after another, but embrace rather the fleeing of fornication, if we embrace the providing for one another's needs within that relationship, 1 Corinthians 7, 3 and 5 through 5, let the husband render his wife the affection to her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. If we rejoice in our relationships, think about Proverbs 5, 18 through 20, when Solomon, speaking to his son, let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth. Rejoice. Don't just live with her, rejoice with her. A lot of times what happens within relationship is our eyes go somewhere else because all we are thinking about as it relates to our spouse is all the things they do to aggravate us. All the things that are frustrating us. All the things that are going wrong right now at home, because there's always going to be some difficulties at home. And not necessarily with your marriage, but man, if you've got kids and you've got jobs and you've got just life, there's going to be challenges, there's going to be struggles, there are going to be difficulties. That is life. But the minute we allow all of those things that are negative, that are happening to discourage us, to frustrate us. Maybe he leaves his socks laying around the house, ladies. I do that to my wife and my shoes too. I've tried. We've been married 18 years. I promise you, I've tried. And I'm better than I used to be, but I'll still see her walk by the pair of my shoes. And I go, oh, oops. She doesn't do anything to ever aggravate me, for the record, nothing. But when you can only think about all the things that aggravate you, and listen, we're human beings. We're fickle at times, aren't we? And if we focus on those pet peeves that we have, then that person that we're supposed to be rejoicing with, well, it's hard to rejoice when I'm nothing but frustrated. But when I think about all the good times we've had, when I think about the fact that she chose me and I chose her and we willingly committed ourselves to one another, which, by the way, when Solomon is writing, this may very well have not been the case. This may have been ultimately maybe arranged for this young man. He's a son of the king. Might just mean that he needs to marry someone for political purposes. We're used to an Americanized Western way of thinking about marriage. A lot of the world still doesn't necessarily treat marriage in that way. And our society often treats it too loosely. But rejoice. You see, when you rejoice, and then you go on and you read here, as a loving deer and a graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times and always be enraptured with her love. When you embrace all the beauty and blessing of your spouse, whether it is a wife toward her husband or a husband toward his wife, It makes all the difference. And so when we think about what Jesus says here about lust being at the heart of it, then immediately talking about adultery, I would submit to you that in context here, he's concerned with the heart of these men and women that would lead them down the road to even seek a certificate of divorce. And the root of that for so many of them with regards to not finding uncleanness, but seeking it for some other cause, well, contextually would seem to be related directly to lust. So how do you fight that? Well, I've given you some suggestions. You flee from it. You find yourself in a situation, you get out of that. Man, brothers, let me just speak to you plainly. If there's a lady at work that's catching your eye, find a new job. There ain't a job on this earth worth risking your marriage over. There's just not. I've seen some guys half destroy their marriages because of some of the women that they are around. And I'm not laying that at the ladies' feet. I'm saying those gentlemen behaving in ways they are not. Not worth it. Ladies, if there's some man that because at home things are crazy with the kids and in the break room he's always willing to talk to you and hear you out. Well, my husband won't listen to me like that. Well, is it because your husband's not interested in listening? Or is it maybe because by the time you get home, you're taking care of the kids and living that life together, by the time the kids are in bed, all you want to do is put your head on the pillow? Oh, maybe some of those extracurricular activities need to go. Maybe one of you needs to make the decision, you know what, we don't need 2 salaries. If we cut back here and cut back there, we can live on one. And we can slow things down a bit for our family. It's all about whether or not we choose to rejoice and pursue our marriage or not. Let me move on quickly because I know I'm running out of time. How long do I have, Michael? I forgot to ask.
You get about 8 minutes left.
Okay. That's not enough. You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform oaths to the Lord. Notice verses 33 through 37. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king, nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black. I wish I could add some. But let your yes be yes, and your no, no, for whatever is more than these is from the evil one. The quotation here comes from Leviticus 19 at verse 12. You shall not swear by my name falsely, but notice the end of it here. Nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Now that connects directly with the commandment in Exodus 20 verse 7. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. To take it in vain is to profane it. The way that we profane the Lord's name isn't necessarily only by using it irreverently. We think about cursing often in that relationship, but the Old Testament's also concerned with taking God's name and applying it falsely, using it without a recognition of His holiness and reverence, using it to gain some benefit. But rather, Deuteronomy 23:23, that which is gone from your lips you shall keep and perform. That's the second part of what Jesus is here. It would seem, however, that as we look at this, Jesus says, this is what you've heard. This is what's been said. It would seem, though, that the people that He's talking to had taken to swearing because they were inherently untrustworthy. If you go again over to Matthew 23:16 on down, you'll see that these Pharisees and others would swear by all kinds of things, including the temple or the altar or the throne. And they would, Jesus points out that all belongs to God anyway, so you're in essence swearing against God, but you're trying to get out of it. So in essence, what they are saying is listen, I know you don't think you can trust me. And I understand, there was this time and there's that time and there was this time. Any of you watched the new Star Wars, the newer Star Wars, the trilogy? I know a lot of Star Wars fans, old ones, don't necessarily like it. If you watch the new one, there's that scene with Han Solo, and I'm not going to give too much away, but he's caught between opposing gangs. And Han Solo, being Han Solo, has cheated this one and cheated that one and cheated this one again. And well, he's trying to sweet talk his way out of it. Well, this time, that's what these folks were like. And so they would say, well, I swear by this that I will do this. Here's Jesus' application. It's simple. It is very simple. Let your yes be yes and your no, no, for whatever is more than these is from the evil one. Don't swear on something. Don't have to swear on God. Don't have to swear on. He says to them, it's not about giving your word. It's about saying, my word I know isn't so trustworthy, so I'm going to have to swear on this. But rather, let your word be your word. Hebrews 6 verse 18 tells us that it is impossible for God to lie. And so that needs to be our mentality. Ephesians 4 verse 25, therefore putting away lying, let each of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Don't allow deception to rule your behavior, but be a person of truth in heart, word, and deed. That's what Jesus is drawing at. An eye for an eye, Matthew 5, 38 through 42. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him too. Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. The heart of this is the quotation Leviticus 24, 19 through 22. If a man causes a disfigurement of his neighbor, as he has done, so shall it be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he has caused disfigurement of a man, so shall it be done. Now, this was a principle of retribution under the law of Moses that was based in justice. This was for a community that was organized around God. This was never about personal vengeance. Well, you did me wrong, therefore I'm going to show you. Some of the rabbinical writings indicate that in the times of Jesus, court cases that were, well, let's just say fraudulent were very common. And folks would try to take advantage of one another in that way. And so Jesus says to his disciples, don't seek personal vengeance. That's what he is wanting us to understand. Romans 12, 17 through 21, repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink, for in so doing you'll heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's what Jesus is saying. He's helping us to understand that there are going to be those who are going to seek to take advantage of us. Don't seek vengeance. Vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. And let's hit up our last one here, which it's blank here. Is it blank up there? Oh, no, it's not blank up there. Good. You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Verses 43 through 48. The heart of it, again, a quotation from the Old Testament, Leviticus 19 at verse 18. But with relationship to this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There's this additive, hate your enemy. That's nowhere to be found in the Old Testament. It's nowhere there. It would seem rather that the Jews, in thinking that they were God's chosen people, and in looking at the commandments around them and the nations surrounding them, they took it to heart. And so, yes, they despised the Gentiles. Yes, they despised the Samaritans. Yes, they turned their hearts against them. But God never intended that. Think about Exodus 22 at verse 21. You shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. When God judged the peoples of the land, He judged them for their unrighteousness and wickedness. Leviticus 18, 24 through 28, God said He was casting the Canaanites out of the land because of their sin. And so fundamentally, this is again about having the heart of God. Think about how we were toward God in the beginning. Think about how we were toward God. Paul describes it in Romans 5, beginning at verse 6, as saying we were without strength, as saying we were enemies of God, as saying we were against Him. But what did God do? He gave His Son. He reconciled us to Himself. He loved us even when we were unlovable. So let me summarize each of these. You've heard it said, you shall not murder. Here's the point Jesus is getting at. Don't allow anger to rule your behavior. Rather seek reconciliation. You've heard it said, do not commit adultery. Here's the point. Don't allow lust to rule your behavior. Rather sanctify your heart unto God and make a covenant with your eyes, not to look upon any other woman, just as Job did. Job 31 at verse 1. You shall not swear. Here's what Jesus wants us to understand. Don't allow deception to rule your behavior, but be a person of truth in heart and word and in deed. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye. Here's what Jesus wants us to understand. Don't allow vengeance to rule your heart, but faith, so that you can trust God to avenge. All the while you do good to those who would seek to do you evil. And finally, hate your neighbor. Don't allow hate in any form to dwell in your heart, but be filled with love and good works. If I could summarize what Jesus is saying in these verses with just a couple of verses from the Scriptures, it's Ephesians 5, 1 through 2. Therefore be imitators of God as dear children and walk in love, as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. Brethren, God cares about the inner man. Don't let it just be the deeds of your hands that matter, but let your heart be filled with the love of God for all men. And if we do that, then we'll be well on our way to taking the inner man lessons that Jesus has for us here in Matthew chapter 5. Thank you so much for your attention tonight. Thanks for the invitation of the elders. And Michael, thankful to be with you. God bless you.